Chandana, student of IIT Madras, extend my special welcome to our chief guest, Sri Sriram Balasubramanian ji, and distinguished guests on behalf of Vande Mataram family. Vande Mataram, our national song, written by Sri Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, played a vital role in the Indian independence movement. An ode to the mother goddess, as it was written in the novel Anandamath, was homage to the mother and the motherland. The song inspired thousands of freedom fighters to come and contribute for the independence of our motherland. Our Vande Mataram family is an independent student body of IIT Madras, and we endeavor to conduct events to sensitize the student community and keep them abreast of the India's rich cultural, economic, socio-political, scientific, technological heritage and its relevance today. Janani Janma Bhumischa Swargadapi Garyesi, which means the lap of our mother and the motherland is greater than any joy of heaven, is the philosophy which kept us going ahead in the last 4 years in this institute and strengthens our national consciousness. We have been proudly following the tradition of singing our national song, Vande Mataram, the very beginning, and I would request you all to stand up at your place to sing the national song. I request Hariganesh ji to lead the song. Also, before we begin, please switch off your mobile phones and keep it on silent.
Vande Mataram, Vande Mataram, Sujalam Suphalam, Malayaj Shitalam, Sasya Shamalam Mataram, Vande Mataram, Shubhra Josna Pulakitayamini, Pullakusumita Dhrumadala Shobhini, Suhasini Sumadhura Bhashini, Sukhadam Varadam Mataram, Vande Mataram, Vande Mataram.
We are privileged to have our chief guest, Sri Sriram Balasubramanian ji, with us today. Sri Sriram Balasubramanian ji will deliver his talk on the subject Ardhashastra and its contemporary relevance in India. 2004 years ago, Kautilya compiled the Ardhashastra, and with it, he proved to be the kingmaker as he enabled the inception of the Gupta dynasty. Kautilya demonstrated how governance, polity, politics, and progress have to be linked to the welfare of the people. Interestingly, closer to recent times, Abraham Lincoln said, "Democracy is of the people, by the people, and for the people." The Ardhashastra's resonant theme holds even true today, and it is upholding of this principle that stands at the core of the attaining development. The Ardhashastra endured the test of time, and it has since withstood the test of credibility. Now I invite our chief guest, Sri Sriram Balasubramanian ji, on the stage. And I also humbly invite Professor Jelihal sir to present our chief guest with a fruit basket. And a laptop bag made by ladies of Mayur village. Thank you, sir. I take immense pleasure in introducing our chief guest. Sri Sriram Balasubramanian ji is an economist and an author who contributes extensively to national and international publications. Besides being an alumnus of Columbia University, he has had wide international exposure, living and studying in more than 3 continents. His key areas of interest include global macroeconomics, economic trends in emerging markets, Indic culture, and an innate passion for India's socio-political happenings. In addition, key research themes such as inequality, new growth models, the financial sector, and ancient scriptures are an integral part of his interests. He has authored two books, Jamba the Joint Family and The Wizards. The former was shortlisted to be the third annual literary festival by the Indo-American Arts Council. Two more books are in the pipeline, with one focusing on the Ardhashastra and would be released soon. He has contributed opinion pieces to publications such as the New York Times, Foreign Policy, Forbes India, The Hindu, The Times of India, and Swarajya, among others. Besides this, he has been an independent television analyst on the economic issues. Now I request our chief guest to deliver his much anticipated talk.
Thank you. Thanks for the wonderful introduction and thanks for inviting me here for this lecture. It's my pleasure and honor to be here. I'd like to thank the Vande Mataram group as well as some of my mentors, Professor T.T. Narendran and a few others who had wanted me to give this lecture. As you see, the title for the lecture is Unique Growth Models, including the Arthashastra. The reason why I brought other ideas is generally I focus on the Arthashastra, but I felt for this audience, especially at the IIT, it's important that you get a perspective of other ideas so that you understand or at least there's a discussion on other topics as well. So the contents page, essentially what we are trying to do is first I would give an overview of the ancient Indian economic growth story, which is more or less untold. Then we look at three models essentially. One is on Bhutan, which is one of our neighbors, and Japan, and also India. So we look at some unique features in these countries and how that affects the economic policy and eventually economic outcomes. And then we move into the idea of Kautilya and Arthashastra. I've been researching on the Arthashastra for about a year and a half or even 2 years, or slightly more than that. And the more I read, the more I get fascinated by it. Understanding through this prism will give a better context of how Kautilya was so ingenious during his time to kind of conceptualize an economic framework during those times. And of course, the relevance of it for today and how sometimes eerily similar it is to a lot of the concepts that we're doing today. That's fine. There's supposed to be a graph here, but let me just try to. So if you really look at the growth story for the last 1,000 years, till 1700, I mean 0 to 1700, the Western civilization really started growing after 1700 onwards, and they became one of the top, the Western countries became one of the top growing countries in the world. The quantum of development and growth surged, especially in the last few decades. Industrial revolution basically started in the last 200, 300 years. In the advent of digital age, systems have evolved and new mechanisms have come to play. The question really is, how is the ancient world's economic landscape? I'm not able to get the graph here, but I'll try to do justice So if you really look at the graph here, as I mentioned, from 1700 onwards, the world GDP just skyrockets, at least what was measured, and large part of it is dominated by the West. And from 0 to 1700 onwards, you don't really see too much of growth, but the dominance of West basically began more or less from the 1700s onwards. So if you really do a bit of micro-analysis to what happened between the phase of the beginning of the Common Era till about 1700s, that's where probably the real story is. So if you take India and China had alternated in GDP growth between the beginning of the Common Era till about 1700 onwards. So India had the largest GDP with about 33,750 USD million, according to Angus Maddison's path-breaking research work. Angus Maddison basically produced a tremendous amount an extraordinary research in 2001, which basically provided a historical perspective of economic growth over a period of 1,000 years. So a lot of people mention about Angus Maddison's work, but if you really look into the details of it, which I did for some time, it details a lot of the economic transactions and the economic flow over this period of time. And not just till 2001, he passed away in 2010, I believe, but his research team has updated all these numbers till as latest as last year. So if you really look at the growth story, India and China basically alternate between beginning of the Common Era. You had India, which had the higher GDP compared to China. In 1500, India was again leading China. In 1600, China overshot India a bit, and then India overtook again in 1700. So during this period of say 1,700 years, these two countries were at the pinnacle of global growth. Okay, again, in that era, since we did not have industrialization, the quantum of growth was lesser. The counterpoint is also that, according to population, assuming you're having more people in a particular country, that could also lead to more economic activity. But the fact is, most of the, at least the Western countries, Britain and the United States, were largely irrelevant during this 1,700 years. And the important aspect is, a lot of the research revolves on this 1,700 years, but where the Arthashastra comes into play is at the beginning of the Common Era. So India was already a so-called superpower at that time, and it couldn't have become a superpower continuously for 1,700 years if it did not have the ecosystem to facilitate that growth, which is what we'll be looking at more detail as we go through the slides. Before that, I want to give some context on what these growth models are. So every single country has particular unique characteristics, and most of the economic policy for particular countries generally follow those unique characteristics, and more sustainable models are followed that way. If you take a neighbor, for example, Bhutan, Bhutan has something called the Gross National Happiness Index. Has anyone heard of that? Okay. So if you look at GNH, I spent about 3 years understanding GNH. It was part of my thesis, and then there's a paper which is coming out next week, an IMF paper which I've worked on, Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index. So essentially, it's an index which they've conceptualized with about 50 indicators, or more than 50 indicators, which consists of 4 pillars, as you see, and 9 domains. These pillars basically consist of sustainable and equitable development, preservation and promotion of culture, conservation of environment, good governance as the 4 key pillars. And there are 9 domains, which means living standards, education, health, cultural diversity, community vitality, time use, psychological well-being, ecological diversity, and good governance. So among these indicators, there are some elements as simple as the amount of sleep that a particular people in a particular area get because of a particular project. So unlike the other countries where we follow a model of GDP, Bhutan basically follows GNH. So which essentially means any project, any policy that comes into Bhutan has to go through this paradigm of GNH. And these indicators within the GNH mold represent the cultural fabric of Bhutan. For example, in Bhutan's constitution, it says that I think almost 75% of, that they need to protect 75% of the environment throughout their governance. So they have a certain set of characteristics which is very intrinsic towards Bhutan, and they try to incorporate it through this index. And their governance is based on GNH as a whole. So this is a good example of our own neighbor using a tool which is very customized towards their own local needs and then formulating policy based on that. So Bhutan is a small country, but if you really look at Japan, a bigger country. So what do you learn from Japan? Japan is one of the highest savings, has one of the highest savings ratios in the world. In fact, it's on an average of about 27% in 2018. Despite very low interest rates, Japanese were not willing to spend. In fact, the Bank of Japan had to reduce their interest rates to negative interest rates to induce them to spend, which is, unheard of, because the Japanese are fundamentally believe in the mold of savings and not spending beyond their means. Large part of Abenomics, which is the new term similar to, say, Modinomics in Japan, tries to understand these intrinsic qualities within Japan and then formulates policies based on that. So this quote in the Japanese Times is very interesting. I think you'll be able to read it. So it basically says the Japanese Public Pension Investment Fund is now the largest single global investor in US equities. SoftBank, which a lot of young people would know, manages some of the biggest brands in the world in terms of investment. And it has surpassed China to become the largest international investor in Australia. And it is also, the Japanese companies are on target for another record year of outward foreign direct investment. So basically, whether it's the domestic savings sector or even the private sector, a large part of them tend to save. And that has basically, and they've used these, they've channeled these domestic surplus savings into the world and also to run their economy. So this is another example where a country like Japan, much bigger than Bhutan, uses or tries to have policy which kind of, formulates the unique characteristics. Let's come to India. So what does India have in terms of unique features? The first thing is more than 70% of the country is basically in the informal sector. So when you really see the GDP figure that you get every quarter, and all these news channels go haywire on that, you really need to kind of analyze what the GDP figure basically tells you. We are having only about 25 to 30% of the economy which is in the formal sector, which means these are occupations which have a social security, which have a contract between the employer and the employee, something like an IIT, between the institute and the employees. And these are sectors which contribute to the tax input of the country. 70% of the economy basically consists of a conglomeration of what we call the Pottikada in Tamil, which is the small stores, small and medium stores across the country. So a large section of the informal sector basically works through networks of trust, family connections, or communities across societies. So these are what we call in economics intangibles. It's very, very difficult to measure. How do you measure trust? Or how do you measure communities? But a large section of this is run by these ideas. And the informal, and most of them are small and medium based firms. The problem with the small and medium based firms is scalability is an issue. They can employ about 10 people, 20 people, 30 people. But employing 100, 200, or even 1,000 people becomes a problem. With too many of these small firms are there. But on the other hand, it also helps you to buffer from an international crisis. So a lot of people credit the nationalized banks for buffering us from the 2008 crisis. I would rather say you should probably complement the informal sector to buffer you, because it played an important role to also kind of buffer from the crisis, because a large part of the credit and finance was within the system within India. So culture plays an important role in our economic policy framework. So obviously I'm not suggesting that we should completely ignore the Western models, but when you're formulating policy for India, it has to be customized towards some of these intrinsic qualities. So and again, India's savings ratio is quite robust at about 30% on average in the last decade. Even during demonetization, I mean, large sections of people, especially in my home, there was an element of trust where, say, for example, if the milk vendor came home and you did not have cash, you basically told the milk vendor you'll pay after 1 month, and then he says, okay. And my grandmother was getting this from the same milk vendor for about 20 years, so there was some amount of trust available. And then she came back after a month and then got, when there was more liquid flow. So these cultural transactions play an important role. So that is very, very unique to the Indian economic framework. Unless we understand and complement it with best practices from abroad or across the world with these unique characteristics, you're not going to have outcomes that are going to be sustainable. That's my broader point. So coming to Kautilya, why did I talk about Bhutan, talk about Japan, talk about India? At a fundamental level, unless you formulate economic policy with best ideas, probably from the world, but ideas which suit the local fabric, you're not going to have a sustainable framework. And I think Kautilya understood this to the core. If you really look at what Kautilya's fundamental goal was, his goal was peace and prosperity, and he believed that economic development could give you peace and prosperity. Besides the economic development framework, which I'm going to talk about later, he believed that strong defense capabilities, communal harmony, and a strong, robust governance are three fundamental things to promote economic development. Speaking of defense capabilities, so he suggested of building of large ports, diplomatic initiatives, and also setting up intelligence gathering and analysis. Had 4 types of fighting units besides a strong fort. And another disclaimer or other something that we need to understand when thinking of Kautilya is it was during 3rd century BCE. So the context then is very different to what we are now. But given that context, if you can take your mind back and see how impressive his vision has been, that would make it easier for you to understand. So, and there were 6 types of troops. For example, Maula Bala, Bratta Bala, Shreni Bala, Mitra Bala, and Amitra Bala, and Athavi Bala. The text also makes reference to distinction between fighters in land and water. So there was a distinction in those days between in land and water as well. And he also makes a case for a strong foreign policy through a 6-fold policy. This is something that I've not gone into depth. A lot of other thinkers have gone into depth on the Kautilyan foreign policy framework. It's called the 6-fold policy. It's called Vijitsu. Though I've not analyzed this in depth here, but it's a huge research work by itself. He believed that communal harmony was something that is paramount for the state. Prosperity and harmony among communities was central to the Kautilyan framework, found it to be foundational to be a prosperous society. Persistent on the difference between religion and state. Imagine we're talking 3rd century BCE. Kautilya was very clear that religion and state had to be independent, and things like superstitious thinking should not come in the governance of state. Many kings during those times used to look at the stars for making most of their moves in governance, whether in war or otherwise. But Kautilya was very, very clear that that superstitious thinking should be away from governance, and you needed to take it in a very economical manner. And he also believed that harmonious social framework was one of the big utilities for an economically prosperous society. So that was something that was a must in the Kautilyan ecosystem. Strong and robust governance. Good governance basically consisted of 3 basic traits. One was provision of public infrastructure. There's a quote which says, "A king makes progress by building forts, irrigation works, or trade routes, or creating new settlements, or building new mines." So he believed that the state had to provide basic infrastructure for people, he also believed that promoting economic growth by removing barriers to trade and business. So this is very interesting. We're talking about trade and globalization and all these things in today's times. Trade formed a fundamental role in the economy during the Kautilyan time, which we will detail a bit later. So he believed in removing trades and barriers to trade and business, carrying and a clean, corruption-free administration. So restraints on the king, for example, were imposed by obligation to uphold sacred law and to fulfill the needs of Rajadharma. So even for the king, Kautilya made sure that the king had to be above board on all activities in terms of had to be clean, had to be corrupt, had to be knowledgeable on a wide range of areas. To be a king, there were lots of conditions, and on top of that is to be clean and corrupt free. Governance should also be transparent. In fact, Kautilya kind of argued for a modern day kind of an RTI where people could go to the king or the kingdom and then request information about, say, their taxes. They could request information about policies. They could request information about what the king was going to go do, or his government, or the ruling class is going to do about a particular event or particular activity. So he believed in transparent governance. And he also believed in the protection of property rights and freedom of speech, and thought was fundamental. Freedom of speech and thought was fundamental in the Kautilyan world. Anyone could criticize, the government, the state, and they were given the liberty to do that. In fact, there's mention of open centers or open houses where the common public could actually go and criticize policies and frameworks, and that was basically encouraged. So Kautilya believed in these things. So when you come to the economic development, it's called Varta, basically the livelihood. There are 5 components that we see here. One is taxation, another is trade, the third is labor, land, and ethics. So these are things which we have even today as part of a broad, if you really take the macro picture of an economy. Besides technology, besides industrialization, these components still have a contribute towards the economic framework. And there were 3 kind of sectors which are very prominent during that time. One was Krisi, which is basically agriculture. Obviously, agriculture was one of the top sectors of which promoted growth in those days. Pasupalya, which is basically cattle lending, because there's a lot of land which is available, sorry, and land and cattle lending was another important driver. And Vanijya, like I mentioned earlier, trade was a very important component of economic activity during the Kautilyan time. So we really look at taxation. Kautilya believed that income taxes and institution of kingship evolved together. So he basically believed that taxes was definitely a revenue mobilizing tool for the government to actually gain income. For example, there is a quote, when there is no order in society, they assign the king 1/6 part of the grains grown by them and 1/10 of other commodities and money. The king then used these to safeguard the welfare of his subjects. So essentially the idea that the money that you gain from taxation needs to be reused by the king as he finds it appropriate to his people and use it as a form of income. But the interesting thing is the taxation was based on 3 important principles. One was Kautilya realized that taxation power is limited. So he was smart enough to understand that if you tax people beyond a particular point, people get frustrated. So he understood that if it's too heavy or too excessive, people get annoyed. And the increases should be graduated, much like how the petrol prices nowadays are gradually increased, that to the point where you don't really realize it's been increased. But he believes that it has to be graduated over a period of time. And there were a wide range of taxes in those times. For example, Kara. Kara is basically the general income tax, which citizens had to pay. It is 1/6 of the income of any individual, which is a flat tax. So if you really look at it, the tax, the bracket that we pay is about 1/5 or about 15 to 20% at a basic level. And then there's something called a bhaga, which is basically tax on income payable in cash. Imagine, Kautilya envisioned or thought about in those days the segregation between cash and assets. So what you pay as cash or panas in those days, which is the replica of cash that we use today. So there was a bhaga on that, and there was a wealth tax. So what is basically a wealth tax? So Kautilya basically said that if people got really wealthy, a small section of people really got wealthy, then it's bad for society. So he decided that if you had an income beyond a particular level, he's going to, put something called a wealth tax. It's something called the inheritance tax that you have in the United States, for example. Most of these billionaires, they tend to shift their money into foundations, not because, they might be interested in philanthropy, but the fundamental purpose is to take their income into a charitable entity so that it can be a good tax reorganization tool. So the concept of inheritance and wealth tax was already there during the Kautilyan time, where there are many instances where Kautilya mentions that people beyond a particular income threshold need to be put in check. There's Bali, which is again an occasional levies, which you had before, I think, the GST, and also Vyagi, which is a sales tax. Another interesting tax which I found is Udaka, so basically a water tax. So in those days, you used to have reservoirs of water if you lived in a neighborhood which was near a reservoir. And if the reservoir belonged to the state, then there was a tax on the water that you consume as well, as part of Kautilya's framework. In terms of agriculture, we don't tax agriculture nowadays, but Kautilya believed that if you're an agriculturist who was really doing very well, and if your produce is far beyond a particular capacity, then you had to give 1/6 of the produce as taxes to the state. Business taxes and corporate taxes are very interesting. So if you really look at the table, for business medium, gold, silver, gems were taxed at 50 panas. Copper, brass and perfumes were at about 40 panas. Grain, liquids were about 30 panas. Other crafts were about 10, and wood, bamboo and earthenware were about 5 panas. So these were taxes which businessmen and merchants had to pay for having business transactions within the country and even outside. Wealth tax is something which we had discussed slightly earlier. And the interesting thing about these taxes, like I mentioned, is that it's also graduated and it's also not, it's fairly flexible. So Kautilya ensured that these taxes were kind of, had to be changed over a period of time. They were not fixed notions. Nothing was fixed in the Arthashastra. Everything is dependent on how society changes and how people change. And Kautilya is very open to various other changes, which I would mention a bit further as well. On trade, there's a quote which says, pearls could be imported from Ceylon, which is today Sri Lanka, aloe from Burma, which is Myanmar, woolen cloth from Nepal, furs and horses from Gandhara Nadu, which is basically Afghanistan of today, and Vanayu from Arabia, Persia, and Balika, and wine from Afghanistan and Scythia. Trade was one of the highest priorities given by Kautilya, and it served as a key driver in his economic framework. Nature of trade was, in ancient times, basically defined by two key components. One was high risk and high value goods, and he also believed in the need for fair and free trading system and high importance to imports and exports. So if you really look at the trading philosophy, there are 4 components that I kind of articulate here. One is revenue accumulation, which I mentioned earlier. He believed that trade is something which can give you revenue to the state, and moving from point A to point B, it also drives economic activity, and that also gives employment opportunities, and people end up doing some form of labor, and the economy keeps running. The second point is a preference for imports, though believed in potential for exports. This is interesting and perhaps contrarian to today's times. We believe in an export-driven approach, where you focus on export competitiveness, and you want to, that's why the rupee is depreciated, so that it's cheaper for you to sell goods, whether it's services in the IT sector or trade and other means. But Kautilya believed or preferred imports and gave a lot of exemptions for imports in terms of taxes, and believed also in the potential for exports. Greater economies of scale. So Kautilya always believed in large, he believed that you had to do everything in a bigger scale, and scalability was, and he focused on producing quantities which are much bigger rather than small quantities. And high and low value goods were also included, as you can see, as part of the trading framework. The trade structure is interesting. There's something called a Panyadaksha. This person was basically the superintendent of trade in the Kautilyan time. So what does the Panyadaksha basically do? He fixes prices of commodities after taking into account investment of capital, interest rates, etc. Intervenes when there's a shortage of goods, shortage of commodities, if there's high inflation, if the prices are too high in the market, or if there are trade-related concerns. Always aware of the supply and demand. Interestingly, there was a team which always did surveys in the countryside to understand the demand and supply during those times. And these teams basically reported back to the Panyadaksha and gave him the perspective, gave that individual the perspective on the state of prices and the shortage of goods, etc. And all of the state-controlled trade was within the control of the Panyadaksha, and determines where and how they produce indigenously or outside the country. If you really think about it today, it's a combination of what the RBI does, and it's a combination of what a Ministry of Commerce person or a trade commissioner would do. That was kind of the role in those terms, in those years, that the Panyadaksha was basically doing. And Samstadaksha basically looks after the consumer interest. So if there's a product that goes in the market and it's faulty, Samstadaksha ensures that the products are of the highest quality in the market. So he listens to consumer complaints. So the consumer complaint forum that we have today was something that lasted then itself. And he would course correct and take on manufacturers or people who make these products and try to ensure that quality is maintained across board. And second-hand goods or first-hand goods were also monitored for quality by the Samstadaksha. The Suktadaksha was basically a person who basically does the custom duties on imports and exports, excise duties on indigenous products. So this was basically done by the Sulkadaksha. There's a variety of trade duties and tariffs. Tariffs is a big topic in the United States and as of now, and more so with China. But there are lots of indications in the Arthashastra which talks about detailed tariffs and duties which are given for a variety of products. And for example, a list of durable articles include a wide range from flowers, fruits to diamonds and pearls on the other hand. Exemptions to duties were given for sacred rites or goods associated with gifts from among others. Imports of arms of all kinds and jewels and grains and cattle were duty free. So he had an inclination to allow imports and give them far greater access and make it easier for you to import products. And duties range from 1/5 to 1/25 of the product's value. And the tariffs were built as a percentage depending on the nature of the goods. Again, tariffs were not a fixed concept. It was basically on the nature of the goods and it was inbuilt onto a particular good and its individual characteristics. The interesting thing is internal trade was prevalent during the Kautilyan time in the Mauryan kingdom. Barriers were removed for ease of trade within the Mauryan kingdom. They moved in caravans, basically called sarta, in groups due to safety concerns, because one of the big concerns then was safety, because there used to be large sections of area which were not manned by the state, large section of area where safety was an issue, especially for travel for goods and services. So internal trade security was paramount for authorities. A road cess called Vartani was collected, and insurance for the caravans from moving from point A to point B. For example, if you're a trader and you're moving from point A to point B, the state used to give an insurance, or rather you pay a particular amount as insurance, and the state will ensure that the product goes from point A to point B without any issues. If there's any issue, then they had to pay back the entire, whatever the value of the product was. So there was kind of an insurance system which is inbuilt within for traders to ensure that products are encouraged to go from point A to point B without any safety issues. Standardization of weights and measures used in trade, that was also manufactured, and currencies and denominations were also standardized within the borders of the Mauryan Kingdom. So basically what they did, one of the things that is explicitly mentioned in the text is from point A to point B, which could be, say, from Kanyakumari of today all the way till, say, the northern of the Vindhyas, you could go and do business with complete ease, very little restrictions, completely standardized kind of schemes, and you did not have to do multiple duties, multiple tariffs, multiple state provisions and things like that. What a GST is trying to do, which is to create a kind of a one tax across the board and make ease of business far better. If you really look at land, which is another big component during those times, the land basically belonged to the state unless it has been leased out to farmers after a detailed background check. The state provides incentives to help settlers with seeds, cattle, and sometimes even cash to boost the standard of living. So subsidies were given to people who needed it during those times. Sunya Vinesha, which is basically one of the main goals of the government, is to occupy and restore unoccupied land. So even though this, for example, there is a quote, even though the state owns the mines, it is clearly mentioned that any person discovering treasures in a legitimate manner claims inheritance of it. So if you found any treasure or there was something within the land that you occupy, even though the state owns it, there's a certain percentage that you actually get from the land. And not all land was controlled by the state. So the concept of, there are definite indications of the concept of the private sector within the Arthashastra. That's something which we will deal next. Land doesn't belong to the Sitya Daksha, is believed to belong to the private sector, and which has very little governmental interference. Samhatar, similar to a Minister of Corporate Affairs, was believed to be in charge of monitoring like private lands across the kingdom. And he had Gopas and Stanikas to basically provide support, which means a group of junior ministers perhaps who could provide support in terms of monitoring private ownership of land, providing support and facilitating private ownership of land. Vikraya, which is again a process of selling a particular piece of land from one tax individual to another through a formal process, through an auction in today's times, was also done during the Kautilyan time. Setubandha, which is where irrigation networks constructed by the state for agriculture. And interestingly, there are also private irrigation networks. So they promoted the idea of even private irrigation networks which can be used by communities if they wanted in the Mauryan Kingdom. Of course, the state maintains, in those days it was heavily driven to the state. They maintain oversight and monitoring in agricultural produce and maintain statistics of all the produce by the statistics department. So there were statistics departments within that monitor all the produce and the general activity, especially in the agriculture space. So if you look at labor, which is another important aspect, there's a quote which says, for example, they attempted to find the right mix of job security, servings, and sanctions to address the issue of moral hazards and boost efficiencies. The idea of meritocracy was another fundamental aspect during the Kautilyan time. Irrespective of creed or caste, Kautilya basically promoted the idea of incentive-based labor contracts. There's a quote which says, the miser should be won over by means of wealth, the proud man by offering respect, the fool by flattery, and the learned one by truthfulness. So he basically believed that you needed to provide incentives for labor contracts. And based on incentives, these contracts need to be established. Salaries were also provided on great scales based on qualifications. For example, you had the highest grade at about 4,000 to 48,000 panas, and the lowest between 60 to 120 panas. The interesting thing is, Kautilya basically kept the lowest income for any individual in the society at about 60 to 120 panas. That's the concept of minimum wage that people are talking about in the West. I mean, in the US, for example, politicians like Bernie Sanders want to increase the minimum wage from $8 an hour to say $15 an hour. So Kautilya ensured that the lowest income has to be at 60 at a minimum. And the interesting thing is, the reason why there was a range given between 60 and 120 is it is a flexible minimum wage. So he believed that in a particular year, based on the economic activity, if this had to be the, if 60 was the minimum wage, the next year, again, you reevaluate what is the minimum wage. So it is again a flexible idea which he had, but the concept of minimum wage was something that he insisted that people at the lower sections of society had to have a basic minimum income for any activity that they do. Interestingly, he believed also as moral motivation as a driver, as a driver of labor efficiency, and emphasized on its importance. The idea of labor contracts, right? I mean, today we have in the private sector between companies and individuals contracts. So Kautilya, even during those times, believed in the idea of labor contracts. So he says the agreement between a laborer and one hiring him must be public. Laborers should be paid wages as agreed upon. If there is no prior agreement, the laborer should be paid in accordance with the nature of the work and the time spent on it in customary rates. So there was both a concept and also a need for labor contracts established between individuals who are working for the state or even in the private sector. So that was something Kautilya insisted upon. We just spoke about the minimum wage earlier. So that was something which is imposed on employers for their employees, and insisted the need for incentives as well for skill-based workforce, and promoted specific skills in certain sectors. So he also believed in developing skills in particular sectors, and there were lots of ideas floated on in these individual sectors and how to build skill-based development there. Ethics served as a central thesis to Kautilya's worldview. Generally, for example, there's a quote which says, government by the rule of law, which alone can guarantee security of life, and the welfare of people is in turn dependent on the self-discipline of the king. So he believed the Arthasastra's primary focus is on Yogakshema and also Rakshana, which is basically protection and maintenance. Focus on using education, in those days used to be Vedas and other sources, as a tool to enhance ethics in public discourse. He believed that ethics provided a kind of a moral fabric to drive efficiency in society. Generally, many thinkers, especially have believed that because of the dharmic worldview that people have, they are sometimes reluctant to take risks. But on the other hand, Kautilya had a contrary view on this, where he felt that the ethical framework that is imbibed helps you to be efficient, helps you to be morally upright, helps you to be corrupt-free, and that improves efficiency in both activities and also economic transactions. Made a conscious effort to reduce the influence of superstition and emotion, and believed that ethics was an integral part of economic prosperity and fairness in society. If you really think about what you just spoke on the Kautilyan framework, you spoke on taxation, spoke on trade, land, labor, and ethics. In taxation, if you really look at, we talk about income tax, a kind of a corporate tax, which is also there, wealth and inheritance tax, bankruptcy and recovery process. I haven't really focused on that, but there are some elements which talk about how if a business goes bust, what it can do. In trade, we talk about the governance structure, something of a kind of a trade commissioner or a commerce minister, import duties and tariffs, export duties and tariffs. In terms of land, we looked at land rights, something similar to what the land bill is trying to achieve. Private land ownership, statistics departments in various units for surveying and things like that. If you look at labor, we spoke about labor contracts, something that Kautilya insisted. The idea of minimum wage, which is again something that we see nowadays, and a skill-based workforce. On the ethical side, freedom of expression. He believed in complete freedom of expression, complete transparency in governance, similar to what the RTI at a more bigger level is trying to achieve. Honest governance and promotion of best practices. It's important when we are contextualizing the Arthashastra to today's times. It is important for us to not exaggerate too much, but also to understand the context in which we're living today. I mean, the scale of governance is far bigger. We know far more information. But if you really look at the concepts at a basic level, a lot of these ideas had formulated in different forms during the Kautilyan time. Perhaps the implementation of it in today's environment, perhaps the scale of today's environment, the complexity in today's environment might vary. But in terms of the conceptual framework, I think a large part of it was, quite a few of these concepts were there then. But the problem with the text, which I want to mention before I conclude, with the Arthashastra text itself, or in general, a lot of these Sanskrit texts, most of them are poetic in nature. So it's almost like a poem that Kautilya tries to, communicate in the Arthashastra. It's about 15 chapters, and each of these chapters are very, very dense, and they're very poetic, and they're also abstract in notion, in the sense that it's very difficult for you to extract multiple elements out of it and draw a framework, like similar to what I've done. Many people have tried, and quite a few of them have translators and some earlier works on the Arthashastra have done this, but there are, for example, in a chapter in, say, national security, you might have a lot of economic elements within it. So for you to extract these elements and then bring a broad framework is a big challenge. And that's where I think the difference is between recent Western scientists who are far more, they know how to market the goods in a much better way, and they know how to articulate it in a far more systemic and a more professional manner, which is what I try to do in my book, which is coming out hopefully in the coming year. So in conclusion, I'd like to just tell you that, I mean, the Arthashastra has been a revelation for me. When I read through the book, and I'm still learning the amount of information that's available in terms of the concepts, in terms of how Kautilya dealt with a lot of those challenges in those times. It's fascinating. But it also comes with a lot of challenges. And one of the fundamental threads that he talks about is to have an economic policy framework, or a so-called growth model in modern times, which is suited to that particular country, that particular vicinity, with ideas from the rest of the world. Kautilya was not a protectionist. He was someone who was open to international trade. In fact, he was promoting imports and imports of ideas as well into the country. So he was a kind of a globalization promoting figure, but he was also aware of the need for local customization of these policies. So that mix, I feel, is very important for any model or any growth model or economic policy framework to be implemented and to be sustainable. So with that, I can take some questions. Just a few acknowledgements. The main text, there's a big translation by Shama Sastry, which is very good. In fact, by R.P. Kangle, Balbir Singh Saab's brilliant book, The Contours of the World Economy. I think this is something that a lot of students need to read, by Angus Maddison. It's a big text. It's almost thousands of pages if you really read the full text. But that is definitely a must read to understand, because it gives you really good scientific research on a lot of the historical growth numbers as well. Corporate Life in Ancient India by Bajunda, that's a very good text, and other wide range of sources, gurus, and people who had knowledge in the text have been very useful. Yeah.
We'll move on to questions.
Sure.
So, good evening. Thank you for your presentation. I've got two questions. Number one, till 1700, we were a superpower, and at that point in time, Kautilya could conceptualize such fantastic economic concepts, which, like you said, are eerily similar to what we are following today, largely following today. So I'm very curious to know, is there any concept, you brought out all these concepts which we are following today, any concept that Kautilya brought out which we are probably going absolutely in the opposite direction today, something that we're not following at all? Anything that he conceptualized, felt it worked that time, but it is irrelevant or just not working today, based on your research? And my second question, sir, I'm very curious to know about the gross national happiness index that Bhutan is following. No other country is following the same index or has thought about it. Will that model work in our country? And if not, why not? Why is it a success in Bhutan, and why will it not work in our country? It sounds fantastic with the way you brought it out. So if you could throw some light on that. Thank you, sir.
Thanks. So on the first question, we're talking about from first year of Common Era till about 1700. There are various kingdoms in India. I don't even want to get into the topic of who ruled when. But irrespective of who ruled during that time, there's one consistent theme of prosperity, economic prosperity, right? So the Kautilyan framework, in my view, is it's before that, in 3rd century BCE. So there was something as a system which was there, okay? In my view, which Kautilya had kind of created. Probably it was developed by other rulers over a period of time. But that system provided the interface for this prosperity. Because my view is that prosperity was not something in isolation. It's not because India purely had resources. India has resources even today. Wealth of resources. But there is an issue with the system, the ecosystem that you call about. I think there's something which Kautilya did, which provided the trigger for this, to kind of have this enormous growth. Or that is the, assessment that I'm making. There were definitely ideas. For example, the idea of imports, right? That is something contrarian to what we follow today. I mean, we, especially in the last 20 years, have been following a kind of an export competitive model, which is fair enough. I think it is relevant to today's times. But he had a different idea or a worldview. He believed in openness of society. He in fact believed that open ideas from other societies will actually benefit the people in erstwhile India before, and that would be beneficial. And even the idea of something like a water tax, right? I mean, that is again, these are things that he believed that even the concept of skill development then was a completely, different concept during those times. So answering your question, I don't, one of the ideas is this import thing which comes to my mind, but probably I can think over and share which are which either are not there today or probably we're going in a different direction. On the second question, yeah. Yeah, correct. That's right. And also ensuring that people who commit mistakes are punished. Because we have harsh punishment for wrongdoers. The problem is the system does not really punish them. So he took initiatives. Another interesting thing is on the king, right? Which I didn't really go in detail here. Kautilya did not believe in natural succession of the throne. So the king had a dynast. He believed that the dynast had to have certain capabilities. Even the king himself had to go through a list of qualities to be much qualified to be a king. And if the dynast was not competent enough, Kautilya was even mentions or thinks that some other person should be ruling who's competent. So competency was something that he laid a lot of emphasis on. Yeah, your second question was on Bhutan, yeah? So I wouldn't even go to the point of saying Bhutan's GNH is successful, right? That's another debate. It's a small country, it has its own challenges. There are many people who are against the concept of GNH or feel it's too naive and it can only work in a place as small and as traditional as Bhutan. But the concept, I think, is very useful. You can have a country like India, which is huge, complex, but you could instill some of these principles into policy making. Not in a full level, but at various percentages. For example, say you're having a particular policy towards the environment. Any policy that you take, say you protect 10% of environment cover, or 15% of environment. These are some things which could be inserted at various levels. For example, satisfaction among people, right? There's something called Easterlin's paradox, which I kind of deal with it in the paper. If I can just mention a couple of points there. The Easterlin's paradox basically talks about, generally we assume that higher incomes gives you higher levels of satisfaction, right? So more you become prosperous, more people are so-called satisfied. So Easterlin was someone, Richard Easterlin, who felt that this wasn't the case. If you take the United States, if you look at the world happiness rankings for the last 20 years, their per capita income has been increasing substantially. But their happiness rankings have been either stagnant or going down over the last 15 years. So the most prosperous country in the world is not being happier. So this is something called the Easterlin's paradox, which is also applicable in some cases to Bhutan, which we prove. A lot of the developing countries, after there is a level of diminishing returns beyond a point on income. After a particular point, other forms of satisfaction come into play. So if you're able to take some of these elements and then incorporate it, either in the form of a soft power or in the form of relevant things in today's societies, for example, sustainable development, environmental protection. Just as the jargon is different, but most of these ideas have already been, implemented earlier. So we could actually, get some elements of these GNH models into policy making to make it far more sustainable. But nevertheless, the Bhutanese model has been there for about 40 years, and they seem to be, promoting it, and they seem to be still continuing with it. And it's definitely one of the most intriguing bases. I mean, if you've not visited Bhutan, you should, because Indians don't need a visa there. It's one of the most amusing places I've been to.
So thanks for the wonderful presentation, sir. So in the country of Kautilya,
okay, hi.
Yeah. So in the country of Kautilya, who was a pioneer of free trade, as you said, we have a section of people who stress on becoming, who stress on learning from our past and on our Indic roots, but at the same time are vehemently opposed to globalization. Patanjali, Swadeshi Jagran Manch et al. What do you think of that, given that some of them are also part of the current government?
Yeah, I don't really want to get into these comparative modes. I'll tell you where the problem is. You take the issue of dating, right? Within the own Indic fold that you're talking about, there are multiple theories about dating, okay? If you spend your entire lifetime just speaking on dating, you can sit down and debate and speak on dating. But at the end of the day, you should, by doing this, you shouldn't take away the essence of the text that is available. So whether, current establishments have a different worldview, that's for them to decide. That's right. The Arthashastra talks about these things. The Arthashastra definitely reflects a far more open-ended worldview, but which is also inclusive of our needs. So that's what that text says. I don't really want to go into a comparison between, because within the fold that you mentioned, they have some ideas which are in line with this, some ideas which are contrarian, some ideas which are similar to even say the opposite side. So I think that really varies. But I think it's quite clear if you're following the Arthashastra that an open and transparent society, transparent ecosystem is important with sensitivity towards local needs.
Hello, sir. Like you said that the Kautilya said that the policy has to be local. Policy has to be local. But I think even during that time, the India would have been as diverse as now. Yeah. So how he implemented all the policy uniformly, because it is difficult in the case of India. And another thing is, when you say growth, during the time of Kautilya, what is the meaning of growth? What is the meaning of growth now? And what do you think the growth will be in future? Because earlier, when you say growth, the demand and supply at that time was different. It is different today, and that's why you said that there is a diminishing marginal utility when it comes to, like, say 10% increase in GDP, but the increase in satisfaction may be 0.01%.
Right.
Okay. So how do you define that growth? Do you think that the growth definition itself has to be changed? And I put this because earlier the challenges were different. Today the challenge is different. Like you given the example of US. So considering everything, how do you define growth for the future? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. Because that's at the fundamental root of what we're talking about, right? Because the contrary, let's go to the the other side's view, so-called, is that in those times there's no based on your population. If you had more people, there was more activity. So that's how you define economy. Okay, India had a higher population, China had a higher population. That's why you're able to grow at that level. The problem in this measurement is, unlike in today's times where industrialization, manufacturing is a set which you can measure. Measurements is a big issue. You take the amount of gold in Padmanabhaswamy temple in Kerala, right? I believe that if you probably take the gold of all the women in India and then say you convert it into cash, we probably become one of the richest countries in the world. So there are lots of, non-quantifiable elements which were there in yesteryears, which we are not privy to, especially on the wealth aspect. In today's times, even in today's times, the so-called growth models vary from country to country. In India, in the US, for example, it's far more certain because most of the economy is formalized. So you have data, which is credible. Data is a big problem in India because, first of all, among the formal sector, the amount of credible data within formal sector itself is an issue. So within the 30% itself, how credible that data is an issue. Second is, how do you measure the 70%? Okay, there are lots of econometric tools which can estimate, but still it's an estimation of a particular activity. So even in today's, I would say, growth models, measuring them in an accurate manner is still difficult, especially in developing countries. In the future, it's going to be even more complicated. I mean, how do you measure, say, for example, technology? Or how do you measure artificial intelligence, right? How do you quantify that into a growth ecosystem? So I think we need to move away from just purely talking about quantitative approach and bring qualitative elements like this. And I think in the future you need to bring other elements to the growth factor, not just on GDP, not just on quantitative elements, something beyond that. For example, another small example that comes to mind is the atrocious pollution that you see in Indian cities, right? So the amount of impact that it has on health because of the growth that you have, that actually is also a variable that you need to probably take into account if you really want 100% kind of a model. So as you go further and further, I think that these models need to evolve. They need to bring in elements which cover more qualitative elements and focus more on the people's say satisfaction, which is one, happiness and other indicators.
How successful do you think that Kautilya was through his treatise over a period of time, 1700 years, in developing some kind of a formal structured economy? Because you mentioned earlier on that 70% of our economy is informal. So in a way, have we gone backward at some point in time? And how did that happen?
That's interesting. I'm still trying to understand on three aspects of Kautilya. One is the structure that you're talking about. When you read the Arthashastra as a layman, it is abstract. But I'm told that, like the Ayurveda, there are certain keys to the Arthashastra, which is again something else that you need to read, that I'm in the process of reading, which could give a better picture on the framework and the structure. But from whatever that I see, the framework seems to be a bit loose. Probably he kept it that way to make it flexible, I'm not sure. On the level of formality and informality, there is no data to my knowledge which tells you how much informality is there. But again, at the point of informality, I think too much romanticization of informality also becomes an issue. Most of the small businesses are small businesses because they don't have other things to scale up. If you give, say, the local putikada, or a small shop in my colony, if you give him, say, 10 lakh rupees, tell him to expand, he will expand. The reason why he's staying in that status quo, he or she, is because they don't have resources to scale up. So, while informality provides certain advantages, but eventually we need to move towards a more scalable formal ecosystem, especially when you need more sustainable resources for the employees and the employer. Because the guy in the informal sector probably gets a loan at about what, 15-20% minimum, whereas in a formal system, say for example you have credit history, you're able to, you have some record of completing loans and having some economic transaction, you'll get loans, banks will be willing to give you loans at much better place. So there's a lot of inefficiency which happens as well at the informal sector. So that is something I think policymakers need to acknowledge, that being informal is fine, it gives you all these attributes, okay, it's important, but in its own status quo, it's not 100% efficient. And as you scale up, you need to, ensure that productivity and efficiency improves for us to provide employment. Because eventually, in any structure that you're talking about, whether it's Kautilya or today, what matters is whether people are satisfied at the end of the day. So whether people are able to get jobs in the market. So unless that outcome is fulfilled, we will still have these challenges. But there was no indication to at least till now, which talks about how much of a formality or informality that was there during that time. But there is definitely an attempt to have a flexible worldview, not a rigid worldview. There are many instances where Kautilya says that, we need to have a flexible kind of a model where he is willing to change. Oh, there are certain things where, especially say on corruption and a few other factors, is very constant. But other than that, if there's one characteristic of the framework, I would say it's inherently flexible. But if I do get more information, I'll be able to update on that sector.
Due to time constraint, this will be our last question.
Okay.
Then maybe we can discuss with the speaker outside. Yeah.
Namaskaram.
Thanks.
I am Ramesh. I'm happy that you have gone through the Arthashastra from our stable. Do you have in your research anything of similar variety available in the other parts of the world which are as pristine, as glorious, as ancient, and as sensible?
Yeah, so that's why if you noticed, I did not make any grandiose comparisons with other thinkers or other thoughts, because a problem is most of these thinkers who had, for example, if you take the likes of Adam Smith in the recent past, who have shared some of these thoughts, there's a lot of content which says that Chinese had a lot of these kind of thinkers that we had, like Kautilya, who had similar ideas, similar thought process. I'm not privy to that. But what I'm privy to is, within the Arthashastra, there's a lot of influences on the Niti Shastra and Dharma Shastra. So so if you really look at the Arthashastra, what it does is Kautilya did not really create it. He basically, I would say, brought everything together into a set of chapters and then inspired from many other areas. So for example, you would see, since you spoke about punishment or even income and these qualities, you will see concepts which are similar, which are there in the Dharma Shastra or Niti Shastra, but the quantum might vary here. So he'll make a change on what he feels is an appropriate quantum for that particular point of time. And so he inspires from other areas as well. So that's why my next area of research, which I'm going now, is on the Niti Shastra. Because as Niti Shastra looks like it's older than this, and it has a lot of ideas which are inbuilt in Arthashastra. So within the Indic framework, there's a lot of inspiration from other areas. From other philosophers and other thinkers I'm not privy to at this moment. But if I probably get to know, but I don't think Western thinkers thought about this during that time. Probably the Greeks, I'm not sure, but not the West from whatever that I've read. Probably the Chinese and the Greeks might have had other things, but as a standalone, the Arthashastra text seems very flexible, seems very far ahead of its times, during that time. That's my assessment. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I now request Professor Verma, sir, to come up on the dais and present the memento as a token of respect and gratitude. Thank you, sir. Now I invite Chinmay to propose the vote of thanks.
Namaste. We are immensely blessed to have Sri Ram Balasubramanian ji as our chief guest. This talk has been a source of great learning and experience for us. We express our gratitude to you, sir, for sharing your valuable time with us. We also thank our faculties, alumni, and students, technical experts for the lights, sound, and videography. We embarked on this journey 4 years back on the 118th birth anniversary of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, and we remain equally committed even today. We pray for your love and support. We will keep serving. Vande Mataram, Jai Hind.
Thank you, Chinmay. Now I invite Hari Ganesh ji once again for the national anthem, and I request you all to stand up at your place.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंधु गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल वंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभाशिष मागे गाहे तव जय गाथा जनगण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे। Here also same. On this website